This video is sponsored by Squarespace. When you think of the top pirates of the last few generations, the first names that come to your mind are probably Roger, Whitebeard, maybe Kaido, or Big Mom, all of which are pretty reasonable choices, but one that should also be in that conversation is Shiki. Because even though a chunk of the community may not even know he's canon, his resume is every bit as impressive as the others. I mean, he was on the Rocks crew back in the day after all, and in Chapter 0, we learned that he even had Roger on the ropes during the Ed War before a storm came raging through, which is also what left a steering wheel inside Shiki's head. But later, it even took Garp and Sengoku working together to take down Shiki at Marineford, in which half of it was destroyed in the process. And afterward, he was locked up and impelled down, where he eventually cut off his own feet so that he could escape, becoming the only man to do so until Luffy did 20 years later. And since then, he's been preparing a 20+ year long plan that still has yet to come to fruition. And that's exactly why we need to put this man on our radars. Out of all the Rocks pirates, Shiki is somehow the last one we're gonna have to take on directly, because every single one of the others have either died, like Zebek, Whitebeard, Captain John, and Silveraxe, or they've at least lost in a significant way or lost some of their major resources. Like Wang Ji lost Pirate Island, Kaido lost Wano, Big Mom has lost Pudding and is just MIA in general, Bakken lost Weevil, and then Gloriosa is just retired right now, but even she almost lost Boa to Blackbeard. So that means we have several things to answer here in regards to Shiki. Like, what is his master plan? What has he been doing over the last 20+ years? And when will Oda bring him back into the story? And Shiki kind of answered half of these questions himself back in Chapter 0. This chapter was released alongside the Strong World movie, and while the movie is not canon, and neither are the accompanying anime episodes in Little East Blue, Chapter 0 is 100% canon. And there's actually a lot of cool Easter eggs in this chapter as well, like Shanks getting Yasop to join, Mary designing the Going Merry, we get to see young Robin, Tanjit, Gaimon, and a lot of other people. But one of the most important things that we saw was some of the Ed War. This is where Shiki brought his own fleet to challenge Roger and try to get him to join his crew, partially because Roger apparently knew of the location of an ancient weapon. Shiki said that with that weapon and his own manpower, they would be able to enact some kind of plan that would let them conquer the world. So there's basically three pieces to this: the ancient weapon, the manpower, or his army you could say that he had at the time, and then whatever he would do with those to take over the world. And because of this war, Shiki lost half of his fleet, and since he got locked up and impelled down a little bit later on, it's probably safe to assume that he lost a lot of the manpower he had built up back then. So rebuilding those forces is probably step one. That would make it easier to pursue the ancient weapon in question after all. That's probably why at the end of Chapter 0, we see him and Dr. Indigo talking about his research on Merview Island, where there are animals that have developed a balance with plants and aren't found elsewhere in the world. Shiki is taking his time rebuilding his forces using these creatures, which was basically the premise of the Strong World movie, but in the manga, I think he's doing this so he can once again pursue that ancient weapon. And I find it so fascinating that Chapter 0, which is canon, ends at the same place where the non-canon movie takes place in. Usually I don't consider movies at all for my theories, but this one is sort of a special case because the island itself and the fact that the animals and plants there are unique and form some kind of balance is actually canon. Oda basically used that movie to show us what Shiki and Indigo could be doing with that island, even if the specifics are not canon, such as Dr. Indigo using the IQ plants to extract SIQ, which then caused the animals to evolve and do things like breathe fire or generate electricity or do a bunch of other stuff, which almost came off a little bit like giving them devil fruit powers. And you know, fruits are technically plants, so the parallel kind of fits. And since the animals do have some kind of special relationship with plants in the manga, I wouldn't be surprised if next time we see Shiki, he actually has some animals with powers like that. And this could have served as inspiration for Punk Hazard too, because Dr. Indigo and Caesar are both clown scientists. Indigo made SIQ and Caesar made SAD, and both created some form of strange creature in the end. There's actually a lot more that I'm going to add to that towards the end of the video, but first, I think it's important to mention that building up strong forces like this is a very consistent theme among the past Rocks pirates. Big Mom wanted the Elbaf giant army through Lola's wedding, which failed obviously, and then later tried getting Germa's clone army through another wedding. Kaido had a whole supply chain for the Smile Fruits to build a gifter army, and Whitebeard had a whole fleet of his own found family. I mean, even Wang Ji was running Pirate Island. But like I said before, Shiki is the last Rocks pirate left with all of his resources for a reason, and I think that's at least partially because he will help introduce us to that ancient weapon, which almost has to be Uranus. And I've discussed this before in my other Uranus videos, so I apologize in advance if the next few minutes sound kind of familiar, but it's so relevant here for Shiki that I think a refresher is in order. And the reason why Shiki has to be talking about Uranus is because all of this happened 1 year before Roger met Odin, and we saw him learn about Poseidon's location while with Odin in Skypiea, so we can kind of rule that ancient weapon out right away. And while he was up there, we saw that Roger could hear the voice of the poneglyph, speaking of a great power, but he wasn't able to get the details that Odin could by reading it, which, was that Poseidon would be born in Fishman Island. Even if Roger had visited the Alabasta poneglyph, which speaks of Pluton's location, he wouldn't have learned of its specific location like, for example, Robin did, who read the thing directly. The only other way to learn about its location would be from someone who knows its location already, like Kozuki Sukiyaki. But Roger never even set foot in Wano, only pulling to shore to drop off Odin after he had already joined. Not to mention the fact it was long believed that Kozuki Sukiyaki was dead, so the odds of anyone going and finding him and asking about Pluton is pretty low. Therefore, it seems like Roger had to know about Uranus back then kind of just by process of elimination, meaning that that was the one Shiki was pursuing. And I think that just makes so much sense because, first off, Uranus is the god of the sky, and Shiki has the float fruit, which allows him and any inanimate object that he's previously touched to float, or maybe more directly, it just removes any gravitational pull that it had on it. And he can use this to carry entire islands through the sky, kind of like Kaido did with Onigashima, but better. And while we don't know much about Uranus yet other than its name, because that's literally all we know, I'd say one of the most commonly theorized points about it is that it can affect the weather, which you gotta admit would be kind of fitting for the god of the sky. And what do you know? Right after Shiki brought up this ancient weapon to Roger in the Ed War, a storm came raging through that sunk half of his fleet. And also, a lot of people think that the egg on Roger's ship could be tied to Uranus as well, and that was there during that battle. In addition, one of the main plot points of Strong World was how Shiki wanted Nami to join him because of how good she was at predicting the weather. I mean, this dude had an entire navigation team on his ship with radars and stuff, which showed pretty directly that the weather was a big focus for him. Shiki even used tone dials during Strong World, which means he may have been in Skypiea at some point, which shouldn't be a shocker for someone that has the float fruit. And as I've said a few times already, I know Strong World isn't canon, and normally I never use movies as evidence, but with how much Oda has blended the canon into this one, it's just hard to ignore how clearly he has tied Shiki to like the weather or the sky in general, which makes Uranus the perfect thing for him to pursue. So then it would stand to reason that Shiki's re-entry into the canon manga will probably coincide with the introduction of this ancient weapon. So if we want to know when Shiki's going to return, we just need to think about what arc Uranus gets revealed in, which will be in Elbaf. But you already would have known that if you checked out the site I made using the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace. And I think maybe the best part about using Squarespace isn't just how good the websites can look, but how easy they make the entire creation process, even including setting up an online store or collecting emails for a campaign. And it really all starts with their Fluid engine, where you start with a template, customize all the different details, and then just reorganize things by pretty much dragging and dropping. What you're looking at right now is my own Squarespace site, and this all took me maybe just 2 to 3 hours to put together. The UI is so intuitive that you're going to pick up on it pretty much right when you get started. And if you head to squarespace.com right now, you can even get a free trial. And then when you're ready to launch your site, just make sure to go to squarespace.com/daxsake for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. As for why Uranus is going to be revealed in Elbaf specifically, I'm going to leave a link below to some videos where I go into that in greater detail. But the biggest reason for me is that Elbaf is a part of what I call the Big Three arcs, where it sits alongside Fishman Island and Wano. Now, this isn't to say these arcs are better or worse than any others, it's just that no other islands other than Laugh-Tale had quite the same setup as these. Each were mentioned hundreds of chapters before we ever got there, and in the case of Elbaf, we are approaching the 1,000 chapter mark since its first mentioned back in chapter 116. Maybe that's the milestone that Oda's waiting for to get us out of Egghead. And in Fishman Island, we found Poseidon. In Wano, we found Pluton. So in Elbaf, the last of the three, it makes sense that we would find the last of the ancient weapons being Uranus. And on top of that, we have reasons to believe that this will just generally be a sky-related arc. I mean, many expect Urouge and Enel to return here too, so Shiki fits right in since they're all connected to the sky in different ways. But even in the most recent chapters of One Piece, we saw the Elbaf giants arrive and and right away one of them calls Vegapunk's cloud a sky island. It's like they're familiar with them already, and that may be because of the Atom Tree. Now, we still haven't had 100% confirmation the Atom Tree is there yet, but it seems pretty likely after seeing this huge tree off to the side in Big Mom's flashback. And it seems pretty clear that this tree will have some kind of tie to the Sunlight Tree Eve, providing some sort of parallel to the creation myth of Adam and Eve. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence either that the Eve tree reaches 10,000 meters below sea level to Fishman Island, while Sky Islands were said to be 10,000 meters above sea level. So if Adam just reaches as high as the Eve tree reaches low, then nobody should be surprised when we find Sky Islands at the top. And also, you know, at the bottom of the Eve tree, deep beneath the sea, we had Poseidon. So on the top of the Atom Tree, way up in the sky, I bet we're gonna find Uranus. This also makes the Atom Tree a prime candidate to be the summit of High West, which was the easier route to Sky Islands that Gonfall had mentioned at the start of Skypiea. So that's why it's the perfect entry point for Shiki. With all of his past Rock's crewmates either dead, retired, or having lost some major resources, in his eyes, the competition for taking over the world has probably never been lower. But at least when it comes to taking over Elbaf, there is still one man standing in his way, and that's Shanks, who we know is friendly with the Giants and was in Elbaf just recently, which may seem like kind of an issue at first for Shiki, but last we saw, Shanks said he was departing soon, and already should have left. So that's another reason why this is the right time for Shiki to return. But here's the thing, Shiki still needs to learn where Uranus is to even do this. Even if Uranus being in Elbaf makes sense, how is Shiki gonna know that's where it is? If Shiki went after Gold D. Roger for that information, like the most formidable foe in all the seas, I'm guessing he didn't have a lot of other people to ask. But something we've seen in Fishman Island and Wano is that the royalty tend to pass down information about the ancient weapons. Neptune and Sukiyaki both knew about Poseidon and Pluton respectively, even before Robin spilled all the beans. They were shocked that she knew about it, which is why I'm 100% certain that sometime during Elbaf, likely towards the end, Robin is going to randomly tell us she's known about Uranus this entire time. I mean, she did that for the other two. But for Shiki, I think his goal is to take over to force that information out of the royalty. It's kind of like when we were in Alabasta and Crocodile forced Cobra to show him and Robin the poneglyph that held Pluton's location on it, which that's a good parallel for this situation since, you know, he was also pursuing an ancient weapon. And both the Elbaf and Alabasta arcs were kind of set up originally in Little Garden, since that's where we first heard of Elbaf and where Usopp knew he wanted to visit there, and that's also where the whole Mr. 3 thing happened. So I bet we're gonna see a lot of similarities between Crocodile's plan and Shiki's, except where Croc took years and years to do his, I think Shiki is gonna come and try to do so very quickly, kind of like how Doflamingo did so in one night in Dressrosa, all because Shiki wants them to tell him where Uranus is at. But then the question becomes, how does Shiki even know that the royalty know to begin with? Well, I think the easiest answer there is that he has an inside man somehow, a fly on the wall of sorts, which is something I think he's been doing to tons of people over the last 20 years. Now, you may have heard a theory somewhat like this before, maybe most notably from this video by fellow YouTuber Ohara, as well as Reddit and Discord theorist and #1 fan of both Carrot and Shiki, Mr. Bushido, which I'll link below. And I also want to shout out community goat Lord Vegeta, who even inspired me to start this video in the first place, because the evidence for this whole thing is pretty insane. Now, I'm gonna do my best not to rehash everything they said, there's a few things I differ on anyway, but I need to hit on a couple major points for the rest of this video to make sense, with the first being that Shiki had plants inside the past Yonko crews, specifically the ones that were also a part of Rocks, being Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom. And right off the bat, I think it's important to say that Shiki planning things out to this extent should not come as a surprise either, because even as Garp and Whitebeard admitted, Shiki is a master planner. He's methodical. That was mentioned several times in Chapter 0. And I mean, he's been doing this 20+ year plan, so that kind of proves it right there. So then when you see someone like Higurashi have access to Shiki's face, and you realize how instrumental she was in orchestrating the whole Wano dilemma, it starts to raise some eyebrows. I mean, she even had a mythical zone fruit to just give away to Orochi. Who gave that to her in the first place? I wonder if that was one of the 6 fruits at God Valley and Shiki gave it to her for this purpose. I mean, Kaido's fruit was at God Valley, so why not have Orochi's as well? I'm actually doing a video about these 6 fruits on my second second channel called Redacted, in case you guys want to go subscribe over there. But I mean, even outside of that, we had this floating thing back in the Flower Capital, which was never really explained. And Shiki's floating powers could provide an answer there, so maybe there's some kind of connection. But you know, eventually, Higurashi was killed after she got in the way of Kaido's fight with Odin. So Shiki would have needed a new mole on the inside, and that was probably Apu, who actually arrived to Wano at Mole Port for what it's worth. But Apu already betrayed his allegiance with Kid and Hawkins before that. He's already shown us that he's not someone that seems very trustworthy. And during the time skip, we saw him basically run on air unexpectedly while on some island. So perhaps that somehow also ties to Shiki's floating powers. And then when it comes to Big Mom's crew, the obvious candidate is Beige. And this may have all started right after Marineford, when Beige's ship got sucked up into this random thing in the sky. So again, Shiki's floating powers could be a good answer there. And both Beige and Apu went through these weird experiences pretty much on day one of the time skip, which was basically 20 years after Shiki said his plan was done. So maybe this was almost phase 2 by recruiting people to go on the inside in different crews. And then when the Straw Hats got to Whole Cake, Beige was the one who basically gave us the entire game plan on how to kill Big Mom, which is just kind of weird, I think. I mean, I'm sure he got some of this info while being a part of the crew, but what made him join the crew in the first place? He probably joined already knowing he would be able to take her down, and maybe that's because he was motivated by someone to do it, being Shiki. So what would have been Shiki's goal in all of this? Well, I think it was either to keep tabs on the other Yonko, or ideally to take them out from the inside. He probably wanted to lower the competition as much as possible before he made his return. And what I think is so ironic about this is that none of his plans succeeded in the ways that he planned them, but they still essentially succeeded in a roundabout way because of how they failed, if that makes sense. Like, for example, Big Mom didn't die from Beige's plan, but it did cause her to start a rampage, which then led to all the other events of the Whole Cake Island arc, which then caused Big Mom to be so angry at Luffy, she ended up going to Wano, where she did lose in the end to Kid and Law. So while that initial plan failed with Beige and everything, the ultimate goal still succeeded because of that initial failure. And then for Apu, his betrayal caused Kid to get cooked and thrown in Udon prison, which helped Kid be present in Wano to help fight against the Yonko later on, and ultimately defeat Big Mom. So if Shiki was the real initiator behind all these betrayals, his actions still aided in the downfall of some Yonko, even though it wasn't how he expected. I mean, even for Higurashi, her decision to appear as Momo and help Kaido led to Odin losing, which meant that 20 years later, Luffy would have to come and finish the job and even become Joy Boy in the process. If Shiki was actually working with her, you could argue that his plans even aided in the return of Sun God Nika, even if serendipitously, which means that all of this led to Shiki serendipitously finding himself into the position he was probably aiming for, being the only Rocks member left who has not lost all of his resources yet. But the other Yonko that I want to discuss is Whitebeard, because the obvious answer for a traitor in his crew is probably Blackbeard, but I do not think this is the case. Now, I can see why people might think this, since, you know, obviously Blackbeard's been chasing the darkness fruit since he was a kid and he joined Whitebeard to get it, meaning somehow he knew that was the best place to find it. But I just think if Shiki was pulling the strings this whole time, it takes a lot away from Blackbeard's character. Now, I'm sure somebody influenced Blackbeard when he was young. I mean, most major characters did get influenced by somebody, but for it to be Shiki, I think that would just take a lot away from Blackbeard. I think it might be better if whoever influenced Blackbeard is someone who's already dead. So they kind of set him on his path, but he's been doing it his way ever since. Versus Shiki, who would kind of be pulling the strings this whole time, since he's been alive this entire time. Plus, Blackbeard has also been depicted as kind of a master planner type character. I mean, an underhanded one at that, but still. So I don't think he's someone who's been following someone else's plan this entire time. But I think there's an even better reason why Blackbeard isn't the traitor, and that's because he doesn't really fit in with the other examples I've laid out so far, because Higurashi, Apu, and Beige all failed. Now, like I said, they succeeded because they failed, but at least their original plan failed. But Blackbeard technically succeeded. He got the darkness fruit, and on top of that, his original goal really wasn't taking out Whitebeard. He wasn't even going to do that until Ace went after him, which then started the whole Marineford thing, and then how he took Whitebeard's powers later on, etc. But the original plan was just to get the darkness fruit, and then actually kidnap Luffy and use him to become a warlord. So then let's take another look at Whitebeard's crew and think if anyone else could have been Shiki's inside man, and I actually think it could be Thatch. And maybe it seems like I'm throwing Thatch under the bus for no reason, but remember, he also had the darkness fruit at one point. Now, we don't know for sure if he ever ate it, it doesn't seem like he did, but the fact that he had it with him, or in other words, maybe the fruit chose him for some time period, is not a good omen for for him, because that fruit almost feels like an evil devil fruit. Most devil fruits tend to match the person's personality that eats them. Like Law was a doctor and got the op fruit, Perona's laugh is Horo Horo and she's a big fan of ghosts and she has the Horo Horo no Mi, and a million other examples in the story. So the fact that Thatch had it at any point definitely does not bode well for him. And I mean, just think about the sheer irony of Blackbeard actually defeating the real traitor in Whitebeard's crew. Like he was inadvertently protecting him in some way. Plus, Blackbeard, Thatch, and Whitebeard all share inspiration from the same real-life pirate named Edward Teach, or alternatively Edward Thatch, who was also known as Blackbeard. I mean, right in the name you can see that Teach and Thatch are already kind of interchangeable. So maybe we actually have the real traitor of Whitebeard's crew mixed up. Not that Blackbeard isn't one, of course, but if it ends up being true that the member Blackbeard killed was also planning to be a traitor, then the irony would just be off the charts. But now tying this all back to Shiki, with every past Rocks member now out of the way, or at least with weakened resources, it has become the perfect time for Shiki to make his return. He's been stacking the deck this entire time, while a lot of his contemporaries have been out there fighting and losing manpower. He's almost like a Pokemon trainer who not only over-leveled his Pokemon, but is also trying to skip every trainer possible to get straight to the Elite Four. And that comparison is more literal than you might think, because remember at the beginning when I said Shiki actually has Merville from Chapter 0 and some type of rare animals, sort of like we saw in the movie? Well, I mean, those things were almost like Pokemon. And speaking of rare animals like Shiki has, I think there is a pretty clear and obvious parallel here to my goat Gaimon, who we met literally on the island of rare animals. And each of their islands even kind of had this uninhabited mountain of sorts too. For Shiki, that was Merville, where they found those rare animals, and for Gaimon, all he wanted to do was climb that little mountain and see if there was any treasure in those treasure chests. And on top of that, Gaimon is stuck in a treasure chest, and Shiki has a steering wheel stuck in his head. Both are like permanent pirate-related bodily changes that nobody should realistically be able to live with. And on top of that, Gaimon was even there for 20 years, just like how Shiki has been on Merville for 20 years. Well, 22 now to be exact, since it's the post-time skip now. But while Gaimon decided to stay because he came to love those animals and wanted to protect them, Shiki is using his for an army. And I think the first time he's going to unleash them is on Elbaf, to combat the famed Elbaf giant army that even Big Mom once pursued. I mean, even the government has spent a lot of time and resources trying to gigantify people. And in Egghead, we just heard the Vice Admirals talking about how tough the giants are. So Shiki probably needs an insane army to combat that, and a bunch of fully evolved Pokemon is a pretty good start. Because like I said earlier, I think Shiki is going there to force the information about Uranus out of the Elbaf royalty. And the way that he found out they even know about that is because he's had someone on the inside, just like he may have done in the other Yonko crews that I described before. But the question is, who would that be for the giants? Well, the boring answer is that it's just a giant we haven't met yet. Think like a giant's version of Conjuro or something. But the more fun answer is Prince Loki. By virtue of being a prince, he would probably have that information passed down to him at some point, just like the Shogunate did in Wano. This already makes him a prime target for Shiki. Plus, Loki even tried marrying into Big Mom's family a few years ago. What if Shiki had something to do with arranging that in the first place? Or maybe he did something to sabotage it so Big Mom didn't get that army. But I think the key here is that Loki is almost definitely gonna be good at heart whenever we meet him. Maybe he'll be rough around the edges, because even in Norse mythology, Loki was quite a trickster, but because he's the prince, that means that Loki is gonna parallel the Momo, the Rebecca, or the Vivi of this arc. The prince or princess who needs our help saving their people and beating a bad guy. But obviously they are all good. And each of them actually started out as an enemy of sorts, but eventually came to our side once they realized we were good people too. So the easiest answer here is maybe Shiki was just misleading Loki, where Loki thought Shiki was a friend and maybe spilled the beans about Uranus, which then causes the dire situation we might see in Elbaf, where Shiki brings his army in since he knows that Uranus is there somewhere. But now I want to be clear that despite all of that, I don't think Shiki's going to be the main antagonist of the Elbaf arc. At most, he'll probably be one of several, because Shiki already had an entire movie to himself. Having him take over one of the last major arcs of the series would feel a little odd, I think, especially with all of the other major factions that are active right now. Like, I'm really hoping the Cross Guild pulls up, for example. But because Luffy and Shiki did fight in the movie, I don't think think Luffy will end up fighting Shiki during this arc either. There's going to be something much better in store for Luffy, I think. But instead, I think Shiki is actually going to fight Sanji. You know, since Shiki can float, Sanji already makes for a good matchup since he can skywalk and everything. But also, Shiki has freaking swords for legs. Like, can you imagine Sanji fighting a guy who kicks with swords? It's like if you merge Sanji and Zoro's fighting styles. Plus, Shiki said his two blades were famous, named Oto and Kogarashi. And if Shiki just wielded 2 more swords in his hands, then he'd be a 4-sword style user. So then Sanji could get some serious bragging rights over Zoro if he were to win. And I think this would be great for Sanji because, as I said at the start, Shiki is basically a Yonko level character. Sanji didn't get to go on the rooftop during Wano, but if he gets to beat Shiki one-on-one in Elbaf, then I think that would be kind of a nice consolation prize. And so that's really all I have for Shiki specifically, but I did want to add on a little bit to what I mentioned earlier about the parallels between Strong World and Punk Hazard. Partially because the Strong World stuff is still fresh in your minds, but also because this is sort of a teaser for my upcoming video on the origin of devil fruits. So subscribe if you haven't already, but this all starts back with the IQ plant from Strong World. Again, this plant specifically is not canon, but we do know there is some relationship with the plants and animals on this island in the canon. We just don't know what it is exactly. So I think this plant is still relevant for that reason. And Dr. Indigo could extract SIQ from this plant, which then caused animals to rapidly evolve, including being granted powers and intelligence. I think that's why Oda called the plant IQ. But this is important because Vegapunk mentioned to us how devil fruits were like the furthest branches of evolution. And here we see plants and animals evolving together on an island that grant interesting powers, which to me raises some eyebrows, because what Shiki and Indigo did in the movie was basically a direct improvement of what Caesar did with the smile fruits, except Indigo made SIQ using plants, while Caesar made SAD using animal lineage factor. You know, both are just 3-letter acronyms that start with S, which is an interesting connection, but Caesar's experiments ultimately turned people into strange animals, while Indigo's experiments granted animals strange powers. And since devil fruits are technically plants, like I said before, I think the IQ plant is just a pretty interesting thing to think about, especially because later in that movie, Chopper mentioned how they only grow from moonlight. And that's important for a few reasons. First, even though Luffy has the powers of sun god Nika, we saw him jump right in front of the moon after he awakened, which builds some sort of association there, which is key because we know several races also lived on the moon far in the past. And then the second reason why this is important is because of the minks. They are basically a humanoid animal race that change into Sulong form when looking at a full moon, again building some important association. And thirdly, we know that in Fishman Island there is the sunlight tree Eve, and if Adam is meant to parallel, or I guess invert Eve in some ways because of the story of Adam and Eve, what if Adam is then tied to the moon? Like, what if it was actually called the Moonlight Tree Adam? Yes, we've had it called the Treasure Tree before, but I feel like we could just come to find out the moon is the treasure. I mean, the Adam tree is probably the tree that grows closest to the moon because it's so tall, so I honestly wouldn't be surprised if there's something there, which would be extra crazy given everything I already said about Shiki maybe appearing in Elbaf. So what if Oda is planning to use him as kind of a segue to tell us more information about how devil fruits were first made? I mean, Elbaf is also likely to be a very Usopp-centric arc, and he's basically the botanist of the crew, yet again tying to this whole plant theme. And he's also the only other crew member who goes by the name of God. But if you want to hear more about all that, then make sure to subscribe and stay tuned because I have a whole lot of videos in the cooker right now. But until then, maybe check out one of these 2 videos that YouTube thought you might like to watch next. Until next time, later.